Hello guys, we are back in new fanfic, and if enjoying this then please share and like part 1. Now let's start the fanfic. Seisho Ryuki had been 5 when he was forced to leave his home village. He was lucky to have his only surviving relatives make it with him, to comfort and watch over him. And to train him. Now that 12 years had passed, the young man was soon to see his 18th birthday. It was in just another 4 days. The black-haired teen was brought out of his reverie by a rustling sound off to the right. He quickly activated his ranged eyesight and scanned the area. After a few good sweeps of the entire range surrounding their little group of misfits, he was satisfied enough to turn off his Byakugan. His uncle had trained him in the art of his dark bloodline when he was old enough to understand the concept. He told Ryuki that it was a means to defend himself from attackers if he were able to sense them or see them before they even got close. It was no surprise that the boy had mastered bringing forth his abilities at an extremely young age. After all, he had the blood of a genius as well. Ryuki brought his black eyes to stare at the people in front of him. He was trying to do his best to please them, as well as keep any and all of them alive. He didn't want to lose anyone else. He'd lost his mother at the age of 3, and he never knew his father. By what the others described him as, he didn't think he'd ever want to know the crazed man. His darkened aura was clearly present in the boy's appearance, but no one minded. They accepted him for who he was, himself. Ryu. The quiet and stoic voice startled the teen into looking over his shoulder. His uncle, Neji, was seen with a slightly amused face as he looked at his nephew. Sorry, I was just thinking. Neji nodded. It wasn't uncommon to find Ryuki thinking of his past. That was one of the main reasons he was placed as the rear guard and not the rear defense guard. Neji held the latter position, his skills and prowess in combat easily allowing him to see and hunt down any enemy that might follow. It looks like they're setting up. When the boy looked over, he could see the small line slowly halt and begin to shuffle about. They were unpacking their things and setting up camp for the night. Then they would move again tomorrow. Nowhere was safe. They had to constantly keep on the move to avoid conflict, but that didn't even work all the time. It was the same routine, day after day. Morning training for the shinobi, breakfast, packing up and leaving to find a new area. Ryu could see his aunt moving towards the caravan as her position as the scout. He had heard stories from his uncle about how the Hyuga line used to be a powerful, yet extremely misguided clan. The main and branch houses were constantly in silent conflict with each other. He heard that his mother and aunt used to be extremely spoiled. Until certain events came to pass, events that made his grandfather a harsh and unforgiving man. Neji Kiyoshi. Is Oba-san alright? Neji looked past the youth and stared at his youngest cousin. She had grown a lot more humble over the years. One of the reasons for that was the loss of all her immediate family. All she had left were Neji and Ryuki. When Ryuki was born, although it was a time of chaos and pain, many people rejoiced. That was how he received his name. Although many people usually called him Ryu or Shokun. The second reason she was more humble was due to the fact that none of them had much claim to anything. They were each barely surviving off the land and made the journey day by day. She'll be fine, Ryu. We should rest up for tomorrow. The teen nodded and followed his uncle slowly to the caravan. As the two approached, many people turned to smile at them. All 3 of the remaining Hyuga were treated with the greatest respect, due to their role in the survival of everyone in the caravan. They were the scouts and defenders of the party. The only other person that still had the necessary skills to help defend the small party was Iruka. He was the sole surviving Chunin instructor of the group. The number of surviving shinobi in the caravan could be counted on one hand. Even then, Tsunade was getting very old. The elder woman was now in her mid-80s. Although she still looked about the age of 40, she moved rather slowly and wasn't able to perform very many physical duties for extended periods of time. That didn't, however, stop her from helping out in the group. She was still the most renowned medic in the shinobi world after all. She helped with colds, injuries, and anything else that might require her attention. The number of Konoha civilians that survived was surprising, considering that the village had been ambushed by sound, rock, cloud and rain. Ryuki stopped next to a sheltered wagon and opened the door. Oba-san. When the boy didn't get a response, he arched an eyebrow and peeked inside. He cringed when he saw the elder woman sleeping with her head leaning against one of panels next to the door on the opposite side. His worst fear was realized. He sighed and slowly closed the door to let her sleep. He turned around and set out to find his next source of entertainment. After a few minutes he managed to find the spiky-haired Junin talking to his aunt. The two had started an informal form of a relationship slightly before the attack occurred that forced everyone out of their homes. He walked up behind the two only to notice that they were locked in an embrace. After a few moments, they parted and shared a short kiss before his aunt left after flashing him a slight smile. The brown-haired man turned around and blinked his single eye in surprise as he noticed Ryuki standing there. "Hey Ryu, what's up?" The teen grinned slightly. "Well, Obaa-san is asleep, and I was going to ask her to help me with a few things I was having problems understanding with a few of her techniques." He lifted his head to look at the taller man. "So do you think you could help me out, Konohamaru-sensei?" The only benefit that seemed to come from this disfigured way of life was that Ryuki had several private tutors. His uncle and aunt helped him with the family style of close-range combat. He learned everything a normal student would from the academy from Iruka. He learned several different techniques and weapon tactics from Konohamaru, and learned how to perform various medical techniques from Suand. Of course, the older woman also taught Ryuki how to use, control and benefit from the monstrous strength boosts he received under her training as well. His secondary dujutsu allowed him to pick things up far more quickly. With the combination of the two legendary blood limits, he was able to see almost everything involved in the use of any technique. The chakra flow, chakra manipulation, memorizing the hand seals immediately and the actual use of the technique. Some didn't even think it was possible to possess two bloodline limits, but the three blood-red tomo marks that would appear in the teen's eyes when he went to train or was fighting off an enemy combined with the pulsing veins next to each of his eyes proved them wrong. That was the only thing Ryuki was thankful that his father gave him, since he seemed to take everything else. His family, his friends, even his life were destroyed by the black-haired lunatic. "Sure. What did you need help with, Shokun?" The teen motioned for his elder to follow him away from the gathering of people so they could work in a bit peace before dinner. The routine continued on as normal for the next 4 days. However, there were always exceptions made on special occasions. The rule had been one of the basic ground rules that the leaders of the caravan had set almost at the beginning of their journey. And Ryuki's birthday was marked as such. He was always treated with tenderness and care, as he was the youngest of the caravan by almost 15 years. The only people even close to his age were his aunt and Konohamaru. As the small group of 34 people gathered in a small clearing, the festivities began. There was an overall feeling of happiness as music and laughter seemed to reign over the silence in the thick forest. This didn't last long, however, as a dark figure appeared in the center of the clearing not more than half an hour later. The demented-looking figure looked around with blood-red eyes that seemed to permeate malice and hate. They soon fixed on Tsunade, which caused the figure to sneer. At the rise of his hand, 5 more figures flash out of the surrounding trees. And the sole fear that everyone had in the caravan came to be. They had been found. Screams of pain and rage were heard ringing throughout the trees as the 5 figures instantly began to decimate any and all innocents around the area. The leader of the forces continued to step forward until Neji slid in front of him, blocking his path to Tsunade. The eldest of the Hyuga quickly turned to his nephew, "Get Tsunade-sama away from here." Now, the young boy was frozen in shock and anger as he stared at the dark-haired figure before his uncle. He was the reason for their current predicament. He was the reason why he even existed to feel this pain. He was snapped out of his stare as his uncle yelled out an order, which he immediately obeyed. He ran over to the elder woman and quickly pulled her into his arms and began to run as fast as he possibly could. He only moved forward for a few seconds before being cut off by one of the goons. The henchman ran toward Ryuki, but was suddenly thrown off to the side as a flat palm connected with the side of his face. The youngest Hyuga turned to look at his aunt to see a look in her eyes he hadn't seen since he was a kid, pure and absolute rage. She turned to look at him, blood limit active, and shifted her head to the left as to signal his continuation. He simply nodded and continued running. Back in the clearing, Neji continued to stare down the red-eyed man. Orochimaru, he hissed with considerable hate. The man simply snickered. Neji-kun, it's been a while. The man shifted into his normal battle stance before activating his Byakugan. Yes, it has. Far too long, if you ask me. The man chuckled lightly to himself while Neji continued to stare at him. Now, you will pay for the crimes you committed against my family. And for violating one of the last few pure people on this earth. The man snickered again in his annoying manner. It sounded more like his was choking on something than laughing. Ah, but you see, that was not me. Sasuke-kun was bored and wished to have a little fun. Neji's glare hardened. Then you shall die in his stead. As Neji rushed forward, the battle began. For life. And for the restoration of honor. Ryuki looked back as he heard the sounds of battle dim to almost nothing. He'd been running as fast as he could to get away. After all, Tsunade was their last chance for anything good to happen while she was still alive. The elder woman looked up at the boy-turned-man and sighed. He had grown up in such harsh and unforgiving times, yet there was nothing that could be done. Unless of course she violated all sacred law and performed one of the many kinjutsu she knew. She had resolved herself to stick it out as long as it took for their group to find peace, but now that would never happen. She sighed as she looked up at Ryuki's face once again. He deserved so much more than this meaningless lifestyle. And now she would give it to him, whether it would break the ancient laws or not. Ryu, put me down. Ryuki looked at her like she was crazy before noticing the look in her eyes. That look was something he knew he wouldn't be able to argue with. He slowly decelerated and stopped as he gently set down the woman. Tsunade closed her eyes for a moment, searching her memories for the long-forgotten technique. After her younger brother and her lover had died, she had done some research in various arts of revival and time travel to see if it were possible to bring either back. Yet, she found nothing that seemed to work without drastic consequences. As she filed through the various forbidden arts in her mind, she finally began to remember the one she was thinking of. It was considered an extremely forbidden technique due to two reasons. One was that the person sent back in time could disrupt the normal flow of time and that could possibly distort or destroy the timeline. And the second reason was that anyone who used the technique would be cursed. Cursed with the seal of immortality. Unable to die or live in complete peace. Being a recluse to avoid suspicions and hatred. And worst of all, watching all those you cared about die around you. However, Tsunade now had nothing to live for. The sole reason she felt she existed was to give this second chance to Ryuki, so he could live a normal life. After a few minutes of silence, Ryuki looked at the disguised woman in confusion. Oba-san. The blonde turned to look at him with a soft smile and gentle spark in her eyes. I don't like that look, Oba-san. Ryuki, there's nothing left for you here. The boy seemed to hesitate slightly before nodding, and it has recently been brought back to my attention that there is a possible out for you. The teen raised an eyebrow in confusion as he stared at the older woman. She began to look around and found a small stick lying on the ground. After grabbing it, she kneeled and began tracing odd-looking shapes and figures in the ground. After a short time, the figures and shapes turned into a medium-sized seal drawn on the floor of the forest. Ryuki was now getting nervous. What are you planning to do, Ba-san? She turned and smiled at him before wincing slightly as she stood. Something relatively easy. And something that should help you live a better life. The teen was confused. He simply stared at his adopted grandmother with confusion clear in his pupil-less black eyes and a frown on his face. I'm going to send you into the past, Ryu. There, not only will you have a better life, but you have a chance to change all of this before it even happens. If you manage that, everything will be just fine. What are you talking about? I can't simply abandon you. Tsunade frowned. I'm not asking you to go, I'm telling you. Even if I have to knock you unconscious to do so, I'm still going to send you back. The boy sighed. He knew there wasn't any arguing with her now. She had it engraved in her mind, and she wasn't going to let it go. Fine, but you better swear you'll be alright. Tsunade grinned. What are you talking about? I'll be just fine. The black-haired youth rolled his eyes as she put a hand on her bicep and flexed slightly and mumbled, whatever. Stand in the middle of the seal. The boy nodded and slowly walked into the center, still hesitant over the entire idea. He knew things were bad, but he couldn't guess how bad they were if Tsunade was going to break the ancient laws by performing a forbidden technique. As he made it to the center, he calmly turned around and stared at his grandmother. He noticed that she seemed weary and completely vulnerable. It was the first time he'd ever seen her in such a state. I just have one thing to ask of you before you go, the teen nodded. Take care of Naruto. He blinked at the name. He hadn't heard that specific name ever since he was a little kid. It was taboo to say around Tsunade, as well as his aunt and Konohamaru. The name of his mother's lover. He hadn't really known him all that well, since he was told that the man died when he was barely 2. Yet he could always sense a great deal of sadness whenever the name was mentioned around anyone that cared for him. He had apparently been a great man, and Neji told him that he would have loved him. His thoughts were broken as Tsunade continued, look out for him. I'm going to send you back far enough so that you can influence a greater part of his childhood. If you can take him in and shelter him from even the slightest bit of trouble, things may turn out for the better. Ryuki stared at her for a moment before nodding. Tsunade tossed him a decrepit-looking wallet before biting her right thumb and smearing the red liquid produced from the wound on both her hands. She ran through a long series of seals before finally ending on Ryu. She took a deep breath before stating, Kinjutsu, Kuen Saihaichi no Jutsu. She slowly placed both hands on the seal before looking up at Ryuki one last time with a solemn and sad look. Good luck. The teen nodded before seeing the entire area around him morph and change into a black sea of nothingness. It was disorienting to say the least. To be staring at his grandmother one moment, and staring into a bleak, dark nothingness the next. After an indeterminable amount of time, Ryuki could see a few small lights in the sky above him. A few more moments, and he was standing in front of something large and black. After a few more moments, he noticed he was standing in what looked like a street in front of a massive mansion. He could only stare at the large building for a few seconds before he heard a small shuffle to his left. He turned his head to notice a masked figure running off with a small bundle under his right arm. Almost immediately, he was at the figure's side, holding his free arm with a trench knife at his neck. Let the child go, and you will live, he stated in a cold voice. He hated anyone who would harm children, even if they had a suitable reason. The masked figure seemed to hesitate slightly before getting the blunt end of another trench knife in the back of his head while the other hand hit his chin with the knuckles of his knife. The resulting blows cancelled out any movement of the man's head, but both were easily enough to knock him out. As the figure slumped to the ground, he quickly grabbed the child from the masked man's arm and stared in surprise as another figure walked out of the gate to his right. The robe-clad man raised an eyebrow in slight interest at the sight before him. Apparently, the fiend had already been subdued by a passing shinobi. The white-eyed man cleared his throat to gain the attentions of his daughter's rescuer, only to have his eyes widen in slight shock. The boy had what looked like the Hyuga family blood limit, but it was completely black. He stared at the man for a moment before walking over to him and handing him the small figure in his arms. Hiyashi nodded his head in thanks and moved back into the complex while the other male turned back to the figure. Ryuki stared at the masked figure with disgust clearly written on his features. This was something he'd never heard about from either his uncle or aunt. Ryuki walked over to the man and began to properly restrain him. After a few moments, the man no longer had any weapons and was completely defenseless while unconscious. He then grabbed the man by the arms, secured behind his back, and began to drag him towards the huge compound. Within his first few minutes in this new time, he'd already been able to see a figure he recognized, even if it was images from certain pictures. And it was one of the last he'd expected to see. On his first night in this current timeline, he'd rescued his mother. Okay, so some of you may get the hints and everything, others may not. I honestly don't know why I'm writing this, but it seems like fun. Maybe I've been reading too many fictions. But this is going to be dark for the first few chapters, as you can probably tell just by this. The technique used was taken from a form of the same technique in Flame of Rekka, only this one can be controlled. As Ryuki brought the restrained shinobi into the complex, he could see many people in the courtyard. All of them with the pearly white eyes of the Hyuga. He was stunned, to say the least. When he was told by his uncle that the clan was powerful, he didn't try to refute it. But the sheer number of people in the courtyard was mind-blowing. At least to him. He continued into the complex with the masked figure still being dragged by his side. He was stopped by what looked like guards when he approached the man who he had seen earlier. What is your business here? Ryuki looked at both the guards before slinging the figure he was dragging in front of him. Both looked at the body, then at him again. A question seemed to form in their eyes as Ryuki nodded. Both guards turned when they heard someone clear their throat behind them. Leave us. Both guards bowed and stepped away as the robed man approached Ryuki. The man turned his attention to Ryuki and gave a small nod once again. When Ryuki returned the gesture, the man raised an eyebrow slightly. My name is Hyuga Hiyashi. I would like to formally thank you for your assistance in my daughter's rescue. Your name, Seisho Ryuki, was the blunt reply. However, the black-eyed boy continued to stare at the man in front of him. A nagging feeling had formed almost from the instant he saw the man, he just couldn't place it. Now the feeling increased with hearing the man's name. There was something critical he was forgetting. After a few moments of silence, his eyes seemed to widen in recognition. He suddenly remembered what his uncle had told him of his heritage and what influence he possibly could have had over the clan had things remained peaceful. He was staring at his would-be grandfather, not to mention the current main house leader. It is an honor to meet you, Hiyashi-sama. Hiyashi lowered his brow and nodded once again. Now, young Ryuki, would you mind telling me why you were outside this complex at this time of night? Several excuses instantly shot through the teen's mind, but none of them seemed to work. So he stuck with the most truthful statement he could. I just arrived in the village and was taking in the sights at night. I was admiring your facilities when I saw the man. Hiyashi nodded and turned his attention to the masked person on the floor. He bent over slightly and pulled off the mask to reveal the cloud emissary that had been sent to Konoha for the recent peace talks. The clan head frowned and turned to the guards. Detain him. We will escort him to the Hokage in the morning. The two guards from before nodded. As they moved over to the man on the floor, they took a hold of both the man's arms and hauled him towards the opposite side of the complex. At the mention of the Hokage, Ryuki instantly thought of Tsunade. After all, she was the only Hokage he had ever officially known. He had heard about her predecessors in Iruka's history lectures, but that was it. But, once again, he had to remind himself of his current situation. If what he remembered was correct, then the Yondaime would have passed almost 5 years ago, leaving the Sandaime to fill his position. The age of his abducted mother seemed to prove that thought, as she looked no older than 5 years old, maybe younger. He had learned that she was born only a few months after the Yondaime's passing. Hiyashi turned back to Ryuki. as a formal thank you, would you gift us with your presence tonight at the manor? We would be more than happy to accept you into our home. Ryuki, dumbstruck by the display, simply nodded his agreement. All he received as a response was a nod as Hiyashi turned his back to him and walked away. As Ryuki followed the man into the manor, he caught sight of the organized cabinets for footwear just inside the threshold. He slipped off his worn and dirty sandals and slipped them into one of the lower slots. After depositing his footwear in the proper place, he looked up to see Hiyashi waiting for him at the end of the entryway. The young man quickly stood and hurried over to the man. Hiyashi simply turned and started leading him down one of the many halls. By your clothing, I can see that you have been wandering around for a while. Ryuki nodded. Yes, my family and village were destroyed at the hands of a madman, and I've been forced to live away from most human contact for quite some time. I was only recently able to make it to Konoha. Not exactly the entire truth, but not exact a lie either. A perfect excuse. Hiyashi nodded. Then I would ask you to accompany our escort to see the Hokage in the morning. He will pass his judgment on whether you will be deemed worthy to stay in the village. He stopped in front of a room and extended his arm towards the door. Inside you should find new vestments as well as anything else you might need during your stay. Ryuki bowed slightly before opening the door. Thank you. Hiyashi simply nodded and walked away. Ryuki just couldn't get over the fact that he was where he currently was. He wondered how Tsunade was doing and was worried for her well-being. His uncle also came to mind, as he was now in the Hyuga compound. He took the time to analyze the situation now that he was alone. He remembered being told by everyone in the caravan that the war had officially started 2 years before he was conceived. He shivered at that thought, but quickly brushed it aside. At the time, his mother was apparently just before her 19th birthday when she gave birth to him. And seeing as how the little girl he had seen earlier was probably 4 or 5. That put him at about 34 or 35 years into the past. Almost double his lifetime. He shivered at the thought. It just didn't really sit right with him that he'd have to watch his only family grown up before his very eyes. And the hardest thing about it was that he would never be able to tell them, nor would he be able to have a normal conversation with them without one memory or another popping up. It was a paradox of ill feelings and dizzying emotions. He, still, could never have a normal life. The young man sighed as he pulled off the beaten and torn combat gear and clothes he had become accustomed to over the years and slipped into the informal robe laying on the futon. As he tossed his outer jacket onto the floor, he heard a slight thump come from where it landed. He raised an eyebrow and looked at the brown rag. He didn't remember anything being in the pockets. He walked over to the discarded garments and picked up the torn jacket before sticking his hand into all the pockets. In his left inner pocket, he found a small scroll that fit snugly in the curve of his hand. He tossed the jacket back down on the floor before looking at the scroll for a few moments. After steeling himself, he unraveled the scroll until he saw the writing stop. He noticed that the writing style was of both his uncle's and Tsunade's. That meant that at some point in time, they had planned on doing what she did anyway, as an escape. He sighed before returning to the futon and taking a seat on it before tucking into the reading he would have to do. After he started, however, a pit grew in his stomach as he continued to read on. There, in his hands, was an almost perfectly detailed list of events that would happen over the next 15 years. Some of the things that Tsunade did not know about were filled in by Neji. It covered from his father's first Chunin exam all the way to his being conceived. Dates and times of important battles and decisions were also listed, as well as who was involved in those conflicts. He could see now why Tsunade had sent him back to the exact moment she did. It was an out for Neji. If Hiyashi didn't kill the Cloud Emissary, then the events that would eventually lead to Neji's father, Hazashi, giving himself to protect his brother would be altered. Thus, he would not be killed. He looked below the dates and conflicts only to see small footnotes with advice. What he should and shouldn't do and how to go about it. It seemed that his Obaa-san had this entire thing planned out to make every single one of their lives a little easier. Figured. He sighed and continued on until he found out what happened to Naruto, the boy he was supposed to look out for now. He froze as he stared at the dates, names and events that took place over the period of 2 years before he was born. They seemed overly sick. He ran over and over the few events listed and couldn't seem to shake the utter disgust and hate for the people that caused the events to take place. Here was a small description of what his life was like when he was a child and teenager, and he could easily see why Tsunade had asked him to help Naruto. The poor kid seemed to have it just as bad as he did, and he had a poor childhood due to war, not the hate and scorn of a village. Naruto, as he had been reading, was the human vessel of the monster that attacked Konoha. The Yondaime had sacrificed himself in order to at least seal the beast, since it was too powerful to be killed. He knew what Jinchuriki were like. He'd been able to meet and spend a short time with Gaara in his youth. The man was overly quiet, but very sincere in his actions and words. He guessed that it was simply the burden they had to carry with them. But as he continued his read further and further down the timeline, he felt himself gag. Things just seemed to get worse and worse, until finally things just ended. He could see slight water marks dotting a few of the areas around the explanations, and he could only guess that they were dried tears. He'd been told his entire life that Naruto was killed, not that he was driven to the brink of insanity and completely past all boundaries of it. Apparently just before he turned 2, the man had killed himself. Such was the consequence of having the demon and part of his mind simply taken from him. Apparently, the seal had been extremely weak, making it possible to extract the demon without killing him. But he lost so much more than simply the demon. It was a little over 1 year later that the first major siege took place against Konoha, which was when his mother was killed. And apparently, she was never in the right frame of mind after Naruto had passed. That was one of the contributing factors to her death. There was also a small timeline of when each of the strongest shinobi were overwhelmed and killed during the sieges and war, his grandfather being on the list a little over 3 weeks after his mother's death. That's where the scroll ended, with a small message that pleaded with him to do anything in his power to prevent most of these things from ever happening. That's when he knew that they really had planned on this all along. Of course, he had no idea what would happen if he altered events that could potentially lead to him never being born, but that wasn't on his mind. The only thing on his mind was how to prevent the war. And if he had to sacrifice himself to further along the process that would stop the war, then he would gladly give his life to save his family. Ryuki stood in front of the older man dressed in ceremonial robes with no amount of discomfort. He wasn't used to formal clothing, even if they were simple robes. Not to mention, he didn't know the man standing in front of him at all. Hiyashi had just finished explaining the situation and handing over the Cloud Shinobi. Now the attention of the room was focused solely on him. It was extremely unnerving. So, Ryuki, the boy nodded, what is it that you wish to gain by living in this village? Do you have any motives or desire to become a shinobi under Konoha? Or are you more partial to the life of a civilian? He knew the first question would be posed, but had no idea on the second two. Well, sir, I've been on the run since I can remember. Avoiding enemies, helping friends, staying alive, and I heard a lot of good things about Konoha from various people. My uncle would have wanted me to come here and live out a normal life instead of cowering in fear and hiding in the shadows. The old man nodded, so I can take it you've been trained at least in some various arts. Ryuki winced. The old man was good. Yes, sir. I've trained with the family and friends I had left before we were separated. I see. What would you say to a sort of test, so that we may gauge your abilities and place you at the proper rank? The boy nodded. Very well. If you are fully willing to be tested, and merely seek shelter and comfort, I see no reason to turn you away. The boy in front of the old man smiled and bowed. Thank you, Hokage-sama. Hiyashi seemed to nod and made his way towards the door. Ryuki stood still while looking back at his would-be relative, making sure he left before turning back around again. Hokage-sama, would there happen to be a Naruto around? The old man looked surprised. You know of Naruto? I heard a few people whispering about someone named Naruto in the streets. They were saying he was slightly loud and loved to prank other people. But they also seemed to say it with such distaste. Sandaime smiled. Yes, that sounds like an accurate description. Does he have any surviving family? The Hokage seemed to draw in a deep breath and sighed slowly. No. Any and all family he had was taken from him. He's going to be leaving the orphanage within the next couple of years. So he was placed up for adoption. Yes, he was placed up almost as soon as he was born. I see. Thank you for your time, Hokage-sama. With that, the two men left, leaving Sarutobi to lean back in his chair while stroking his beard. Things could get interesting. A.N. Switching to his nickname. As the days passed, many people around the town were gossiping as the new arrival passed through the streets. Many people whispered that he was the one that rescued the Hyuga heir, while others whispered that he was staying with the Hyuga family. No rumors had been circulated yet, but he could only guess what some of them would say. He could almost imagine the stupid and absurd things that they would whisper about. Like his marriage into the Hyuga clan as a reward for rescuing the heir, or something equally as lame. He continued to wander around the town to gain his bearings and to memorize the setting. He'd been doing this for the past few days. First, he'd acquainted himself with the area in and around the Hyuga complex, as Hiyashi stated he would allow him to stay, as personal thanks for saving his daughter, until Ryu could find a place of his own. He'd been touring around town for the last week or so since then. He'd get up and train for a while in the morning before accepting lunch. Then he would spend a few hours simply walking around the town to get to know the scenery. He'd already walked through most of the huge business district, as well as saw where the ninja academy and hospital were. He was currently walking through the part of town that he could only guess was the market district. Stands full of meats, fruit and other assorted food items were spread along the street. As he continued on his way, Ryu couldn't help but notice the odd looks he got. He had to admit that it probably was odd for someone to be wearing robes all the time while walking around, but he didn't really have a choice. Or did he? He quickly turned to his left and continued down the street to where he remembered the business district being. He had been surprised when he opened the old, decaying piece of leather that Tsunade had tossed him. The number of bills, and even coins, was astounding. It didn't seem that heavy at all. Yet in the wallet itself was almost enough money to last an entire month without needing to take a job or anything of the sort after buying any necessities. He figured that some of that money could be spent in getting himself new attire. As he continued down the street, he saw a few different shops that caught his interest. He entered the one closest to his right and began to slowly browse through the items present. He found a black undershirt style that looked as though it would fit nicely, as well as a few different pairs of knee-length dark blue shorts. They had various pockets and even a few loops for scrolls. After finding nothing else that fit his fancy, he paid for the 5 pairs of shorts and black shirts and walked to the next store. This one seemed to be more battle-oriented, as he saw a different kind of arm guards, shin guards and even chest plates. He looked around the store for a bit before finding something that he'd seen Konohamaru wear before. It was a full upper body chain-link shirt that ran to just below the elbow and cinched off. He grabbed 2 of the shirts before looking around to see if he could find anything else before heading off. As he passed the arm guard section, he couldn't help but stop and stare at one of the items on display. It looked like a set of elbow-length, fingerless gloves, but they had a sort of pocket was hidden underneath the wrists that seemed like they could stash kunai or other weapons. On top were silver metal plates that curved and rolled at the edges, giving it the look of a small shield. He looked at the bottom of the gloves to see if he could possibly fit the trench knives he'd been given as a gift, and was pretty much excited when he found that the pocket went in almost a whole 15 centimeters. That was more than long enough to keep his knives hidden until he would be in need of their offensive capabilities. He also grabbed a roll of bandages to cover his left leg, since he was used to having the left pant leg and nothing on the right. Finishing off the overall new look with a black, sleeveless, high-collared trench coat and blue shinobi sandals, he quickly went to the cashier and paid. He then asked if he would be permitted to change in the available dressing rooms, which the cashier agreed to. After walking into the small stall, he began to fully equip himself. After finishing his changing session, he walked back out with the robes in the white bag that the cashier had given him and thanked the man before walking back outside. The armguards would take a little getting used to, but other than that he felt perfectly fine. He walked to the last store on his left and entered to see a brown-haired woman with brown eyes. She smiled at him as he entered and he smirked back. Looking around, he noticed that this particular shop was dedicated to weaponry. Perfect. After finding a leg holster for various airborne weapons, he set out to fill said holster with what he knew he would need. When that need was fulfilled, he took the time to look around the ship and also noticed a small pouch that seemed to wrap around the waist and fit in the small of the wearer's back. He grabbed that as well. It would be the perfect place to hide anything he might need. As he left the shop with his new items, he only had one last thing on his mind. He needed something to cover his eyes. He knew that many people would be extremely suspicious of his black, pupil-less eyes. Not to mention they would question him on why they seemed to have hints of red sometimes as well. He looked around various stores, only to find nothing that suited his needs. He then looked at one of the clocks on the wall and noticed what time it was. He continued to browse around town, but didn't find anything that caught his fancy. As he passed by what he suspected was the residential area, he could see a small billboard with various papers tacked onto it. As he looked at it, he could see that various apartments were up for rent and ranged from 3-bedroom 2-bath to 1-bedroom and half a bath. He decided to come back and check out the potential prospects in bit. He had something else on his mind. Thus, he turned his attention back to the road and continued to walk toward the building he saw in the distance. Ryu had discovered when the orphanage was on his own when he'd wandered through the village. And he could see the building outline in front of him. He could also see many children playing, as well as heard happy laughter all around the outside area. He smiled to himself as he continued to walk to front doors of the building. It was then that he noticed a smaller figure hiding behind one of the bushes, his back against the tree. The only thing that Ryu could see was a flash of yellow hair. The teen continued up and into the building, stopping at what seemed like a front desk. After a few moments, a girl, probably no older than himself, stepped out of the back and smiled. "Welcome. Is there anything I can help you with?" The warm smile seemed to at least loosen Ryu's nerves slightly before he nodded. "I was told that I could find a Naruto at this present location. Would it be possible for me to meet with him?" "You wish to speak with Naruto-chan?" The girl seemed slightly surprised, but that was replaced by a glint in her eyes as he nodded. "Yes, I can get him for you. Wait a moment please." With that, the girl took off outside before he could hear her calling for Naruto, telling him he had a visitor. After she finished the sentence, the sounds outside seemed to stop. He could feel the air growing tense before the girl walked back in with a bright yellow-haired boy with little whisker marks on each his cheeks. Ryu couldn't help but grin as he saw the marks. They, indeed, showed that he was the holder of a demon. After all, each demon left their own little mark on their carriers. Gaara's marks were the thick black rings completely around his eyes. He kneeled down, after putting the bags down, and looked at the boy with a slight grin. "Hey they little guy. Are you busy?" When Naruto's head dipped slightly and he shook his head slowly, Ryu could tell he was slightly depressed about something. "Well, I wanted to talk to you for a moment, if you don't mind." When he nodded, still slowly, the teen reached over and patted his head before messing with his already untamed blonde locks. The girl seemed to look on in amazement as the teenage boy in front of her started to ask Naruto various questions about his life, how he liked it there and his friends. He was slightly disappointed to find out that he hated life at the orphanage, had no friends, and was constantly avoided and ignored by everyone except the girl, who he named as Kyochi. Kyochi could only look on in the hopes that the man standing in front of her would finally give Naruto a place to live. She knew he hated the life he was thrust into, but she could do nothing about it, as she barely made enough money to support herself. When the teen stood up, Naruto seemed to be grinning before he turned to Kyochi. "I'm gonna go to my room." When the girl nodded in acknowledgement, he shot off down the hallway and up the stairs to the second floor. The male turned to her with an amused look on his face as he picked up the bags on the floor. "I'm not going to be around for a few days as I still need to get acquainted with the town. After I have everything settled, I'll be back." Would his papers be ready by then? Kyochi's wide eyes were all the proof he needed to see that she was utterly shocked that this was happening. However, before she could answer in the affirmative, another lady stepped out from the back. "Are you sure you wouldn't be interested in any of the other children? That little demon is quite a problem. We have plenty of other more well-behaved boys and girls. I'm sure you would be delighted in meeting with them." Ryu frowned as he looked at the slightly obese lady in front of him. She had wrinkles everywhere in her face, which made it look almost like a prune. Her thick-rimmed glasses were pitched atop her ears as a golden chain ran down from the earpiece sides. Her dark green eyes held something he couldn't quite place. "No, I think I'm fine." "Are you absolutely sure?" Now Ryu was starting to get annoyed. "Look, I don't know what that kid ever did to any of you, but as far as I can tell he's as harmless as they come." The older woman snorted. "That's because you don't know the little brat well enough." Ryu sighed. "Just have his papers ready, I'll be back soon." As the dark-haired boy left the orphanage, he could feel the glares being directed at him by not only the older lady, but some of the younger staff as well. That didn't bode well. Naruto was looking around fidgeting. He'd been waiting for almost 10 minutes for the stranger to come back, since he said he'd be right back. He desperately hoped that the man would come back. He desperately hoped it wasn't a trick put on by the heads of the orphanage. They'd done so in the past to get his hopes up, only to have them completely crushed. It was a cruel cycle of physical and mental torture. But the man hadn't shown up again. Naruto looked back at the clock to notice that the minute hand had shifted over to the right to signal another 10 minutes had gone by. He sighed and lowered his head before realizing it probably was just another hoax. As he got up and started to walk down the hallway, he was stopped by a voice at the door. "Where you going, squirt?" Naruto instantly spun around and grinned at the sight. The same man was there before, but this time he wasn't holding anything at all. Gone were the white bags that he'd recognized as belonging to the shopping district. That was why he was late. He had to drop off all the crap that seemed to be in those bags. The grin widened as he saw the slightly confused look on the man's face. "Nowhere. You ready to go?" When the boy nodded eagerly, he only grinned. "Okay, now we just have to wait for Kyochi-san to arrive so we can tell her." "Waiting won't be necessary," said the slightly bitter voice as the older lady from before walked out of the back with a few papers in her hands. "Are you absolutely sure you want this mongrel? You could probably find much better." Ryu looked over to Naruto and rolled his eyes, only to receive a grin from the boy. "I'm fine. Besides, I've heard about the kid and he's a little more like me than he may realize. We're going to get along just fine." Naruto's eyes widened slightly at that statement. Did this guy have no family too? Was he just as alone as he was? The old lady simply snorted and walked away. "Do what you will. Now please, leave." Ryu raised an eyebrow before looking over to the blonde-haired boy and motioned to the door with his head. The small boy immediately ran over to the threshold and looked back at the man with a huge smile. Things were starting to look up for the young outcast. Naruto couldn't believe that at least something was going right. First, He'd met a fairly nice guy earlier that day and they had a small chat before the man had told him he'd be back to take him out to lunch so they could talk more. After that, they had gone to Naruto's favorite place to eat. When they arrived at the stand, the man behind the counter smiled and welcomed them. Naruto had then proceeded to eat his fill, much to the amusement of the man. He said he couldn't believe how something so small could eat so much. After lunch, the conversation had turned more casual, as the man, who told him to call him Ryu, began to tell Naruto about his similar experiences in life. It seemed that the two of them had a great deal in common. He listened as Ryu told him how he never knew his father and his mother died when he was extremely young. That left his uncle and aunt to take care of him. But they could never stay in one area for long, as they would be targeted by enemies. And that he had only recently come to the village to try to live a normal life. He said it was somewhere around a week and a half ago that he'd made it to the village in the middle of the night. By the end of the small exchange of stories, Naruto had a new feeling brewing in him. He could tell that it began when he met Ryu, but it seemed to grow and grow as he listened to a story almost exactly like his own. They were kin. They shared a bond of pain that most people would never understand. That alone held hope with Naruto. When they walked back to the orphanage, Naruto began to feel slightly depressed. After all, things were never going to change. He may have made a new friend, but that didn't mean anything. As they walked inside, Naruto turned and smiled, "Thanks for lunch." Ryu waved his hand in a dismissive manner, "No big deal. Listen, I still have to get everything settled in. I'm looking for a place and it may be a while yet. So I'll probably see you in a couple days, alright?" Naruto instantly perked up at that sentence and nodded, "Sure." Ryu tousled his hair slightly before turning around and walking out the door. And for the first time in what seemed like his entire life, Naruto smiled. Not one of his fake grins or fake appreciative smiles, but an actual, true smile. Yay! Things were definitely looking up. After leaving the orphanage and wandering around the residential district for a while, Ryu finally found a place that seemed to fit the needs of two people. It was a fairly small 2-bedroom 1-bath with a kitchen and living room. The back room was slightly larger than the front, but that was because the space in the front room was reduced to accommodate for the bathroom. Otherwise, the bathroom would have been extremely narrow. The living area wasn't anything special either. It looks to be about 5 square meters in size. The kitchen was most like a small kitchenette that seemed to stem off from the living area. A stove, sink and refrigerator were the only noticeable things in sight besides the cupboards. There was a small pantry in the back of the kitchen against the adjoining wall to the living area. All in all, he guessed it was a suitable enough place to live. It wouldn't be a glamorous life per se, but it didn't look like it would be extremely unbearable either. After talking to the landlord, he agreed on the rent and signed a lease contract that would entitle him to live there as long as he kept up with the rent. He accepted the key to the apartment, as well as the backup key, and walked back to the 3rd-story apartment. After depositing his bags near the door, he made a mental note to look for 2 futons, a table, a couple chairs and anything else a normal household might need. Granted, he wasn't exactly sure of what that was, but he had an idea. As he set out again, he turned around and looked at the small apartment with a smirk. His first real home. 2 days passed, and Naruto hadn't seen Ryu at all. He was kind of hoping that the man would just stop by and take him to lunch again, or just to stop and talk with him. But after that first day, he hadn't seen any sign of the black long-haired man. The days seemed to drag by for him, not really having anything to do but having everything to think about. So he waited, and waited, and waited, hoping that Ryu would at least come back to visit him. The blonde-haired boy noticed that the older members of the orphanage staff seemed to avoid him even more after Ryu came. He didn't know why, though. And Kyochi seemed to smile at him much more often. And still, he didn't seem to know why. He was in his room when he was called out into the main hall by Kyochi. She didn't say why though, only that he was wanted. Maybe it was another one of those stupid talks that he always ignored. He shuffled down the hall and climbed down the stairs, only to stop as he saw a familiar figure. The black-eyed individual grinned at the response he got. "Hey Squirt." Ryu. The blonde-haired boy ran over and seemed to jump up and down beside him. After a few moments, he seemed to calm down. "Are we going out for lunch today again?" Naruto asked with a hopeful look. "Nope." Ryu noticed that he seemed to deflate a little. "Go get your stuff." Huh. Naruto looked up at the man in confusion. He didn't know what to make of the situation. Did Ryu just tell him to go get his stuff? "Go get your stuff, Squirt. I should be done with everything by the time you get back." Naruto simply nodded, not really getting the message. As he went back to his room, he began to pack all the things he owned in a simple square cloth. He only had a few different pairs of clothes as well as a few presents that Sarutobi Jisun gave him. As he finished his packing, things were finally starting to dawn on him. If Ryu wanted him to get his things, he immediately finished off the bundle with a small knot on top and rushed back down the hall and stairs, only to see Ryu hand over a small stack of papers to the old lady who ran the place. "There, that should cover everything, right?" The old lady nodded. "Yes, all the paperwork has been filled out according to policy, but there is still the payment policy that needs to be fulfilled." Ryu frowned. "How the hell can you charge someone to adopt a kid? It's policy to accept payment before the finalization of the contract so that we know you are serious about the responsibility." Ryu frowned and grumbled to himself, which caused Naruto to lose some of his cheer. Was he having second thoughts? Ryu simply pulled out an odd-looking package from his pocket before shuffling through it and pulling out a few bills. After that, he handed them to the lady with a small hint of disgust. After taking the bills from Ryu's hand, the old lady simply nodded. "Now that the contract is finalized, please leave." Ryu could take a hint. Basically, she meant, "Get out and don't come back," which was fine by him. He never planned on coming back to the place ever again after this was done with. He turned to the hallway and saw Naruto staring at him. He then noticed a small cloth sack in his hand. "Are those your things?" After receiving an affirmative nod, he frowned. Ryu motioned for the boy to walk over and put a hand on his head. "What do you say we blow this joint, huh?" The eager nod was all he needed before he put a hand on the back of Naruto's head and gently pushed him towards the door. After leaving the orphanage, he was led to the residential district by the man that adopted him. They stopped in front of one particular building before climbing up 3 flights of stairs and stopping at the door 4 doors down from the stairwell. Ryu pulled a key out of his pocket before sticking it in the lock and unlocking the door. He placed the key back in his pocket, put a hand on the door and turned to Naruto with a grin. "Here we are, Squirt. Welcome to your new home." And with that sentence the door was slowly swung open to reveal the rather small apartment. Naruto could only stare for a few moments before he felt himself tear up. Finally someone cared. It had taken a while for Ryu to calm the kid down, but he felt he could understand the major wash of emotions the kid was dealing with. After all, he'd dealt with them before too. Heck, he had to deal with them the moment he was sent off. Only he was mature enough to control most of them. Naruto was still a kid, so he didn't have a full grasp on most things yet. After setting everything down, Ryu practically dragged him to the business district. The slight chatter and smiles that he'd always heard and received when walking around now became heavy whispering. He was aware that the gossip would start almost as soon as he was seen with Naruto, but he didn't expect it to happen with the first 3 people that saw them. The wary and appraising glances he'd previously received were turned into hardened stares and even glares from the older villagers. It was slightly unnerving how quickly people could change their outlook on something, but he didn't care. If he had to shoulder part of the boy's burden just for his life to improve by a small fraction, he'd do it. He'd always been taught to put others before himself. His uncle also told him that it came naturally from his mother. And it was required in the kind of life he lived. He pushed Naruto into one of the shops he'd went to a few days ago and started going over the selections of clothes he thought would fit the boy. All Naruto seemed to have to his name were a few shirts with an incomplete Konoha symbol on them and a few pairs of black shorts. Yet Naruto seemed to reject every single idea he came up with. Although he did take a liking to a darker blue shirt that was lined with orange at the sleeves, neck and waistline. After arguing with him, he finally gave in and let the kid get a couple of the shirts. A few more casual black, blue and white shirts later, and all they needed were his lower garments. Once again, arguments ensued as Naruto started to pick out what looked like orange jogging pants. Ryu kept telling him that orange would draw too much attention to him, but Naruto simply shrugged it off. The kid was stubborn. He had a far stronger will than Ryu did at this point, so he won out. The total look was finished off by a pair of blue sandals and an odd-looking red bandana that would help keep the blonde's hair out of his eyes. After they finished shopping and paid, Ryu ushered the boy back to the apartment to discuss a few things. Once again, he could feel the stares and glares find their way to him, and he continued to mess around with Naruto as if he were a plaything, despite the boy's loud protests. After a quick luncheon, Naruto began to ask an incredible amount of questions that seemed to pop into his mind. The first, and most important, being a simple, why? Ryu had just smiled, shook his head and answered, why not? That simply confused the boy, but didn't stop him from asking anything that came to his mind. Personal questions were asked on both sides as both boys wanted more information on the other. Some new things were added to Ryu's mental list of the things he already knew about the boy, while everything Naruto learned was new. When Naruto asked if he was a shinobi, Ryu simply shrugged. I have an audience with the Hokage tomorrow to talk about that. Something about a skills test. I talked to him again after I first met him and he said he'd give me a 2-week grace period to set up everything I needed and support myself. You're going to talk to the old man? Ryu raised an eyebrow. He lets you get away with calling him that? Naruto shrugged in return. Ryu shook his head and walked over to the sink to finish washing the dishes, as Naruto had pulled him away from that duty with his questions. Naruto simply followed the man into the kitchen and watched for a bit. As Ryu finished with the dishes, he began to put them in their proper places in the various cabinets. Ryu turned to see Naruto simply standing there, staring at him. He grinned, but as he opened his mouth to say something, he was interrupted by a knock on the door. He turned to eye the door with a raised brow before looking at Naruto and shrugging. He moved past the blonde before stopping at the door and opening it slightly to see who was there. After a few moments, the door was fully open as he looked at a pair of men in front of him. From what he could tell by the pearl-colored eyes and informal robes, it was a pair of Hyuga branch members. Can I help you? One of the guards nodded. We come on behalf of the main house. They wish for an audience with you at the complex as soon as you are available. Ryu nodded and motioned for Naruto to move forward and follow. He saw the faces of the Hyuga guards become slightly less inviting and far more stern. I have time now. Lead the way. Naruto looked around in wonder at the area they had arrived in. The place was absolutely huge. As he looked up at Ryu, he could see the man was casting a wary eye around him. He obviously was on guard, but why? Naruto didn't know. As they moved deeper into the complex grounds, Ryu couldn't help but feel slightly unnerved. Something was going on. As they reached the main building, both parties discarded their footwear and Naruto and Ryu continued to follow their escort. Soon, they reached an intersection with a wider hallway with 2 wide doors near the end of it on the right, while the current hallway they were in continued on. It was at this point that Ryu was separated from Naruto and the older boy was taken to the doors while Naruto was led further down the hallway. Naruto looked up at Ryu, who nodded before following his escort. Naruto turned around and eyed the guard suspiciously as he was led further and further down the hallway. After a few minutes, he was led into what looked like a back courtyard with a small pond at the far side. He was motioned to continue on as the guard stood by the doorway and watched the apprehensive boy walk out and around the courtyard. After a few moments of looking around, Naruto began to wander around the large open space. In the middle of the courtyard was a simple cobblestone walkway with small lanterns set every few meters on either side to light the path when it was dark. To the left of the pathway was what looked like a small flower garden, which continued for a ways before ending at what appeared to be a pit of sand. The sand seemed to swirl and wave around the pit, and circled several small rocks that seemed to be placed in completely random and odd spots. Naruto had no idea what to think of it. He turned his head to look to the right and noticed that it was far more open than the right. There was about a good 6 meters to the small pond, and all that was in sight on the ground was the small cobblestone walkway. Around the pond were a few benches that appeared to be placed in random spots along the bank. Naruto looked at the small body of water and noticed that a few things seemed to be moving below the reflective surface. He moved along the pathway to the large puddle and noticed various small koi swimming around underneath the surface of the water. He stared at them in amazement for a moment, as he'd never seen koi before. They looked so graceful as they swam. He moved to sit on a bench off to the left side of the pond, as that particular wooden creation was just below a tree that would provide ample shade as he continued to watch the fish. After a few moments, he could hear someone else approaching. He figured it was another guard that was coming over to check if he was behaving himself or not. But as he looked up, his eyes could only widen at the sight before him. A small girl, no older than him, was staring at him with her mouth slightly agape. Apparently, she hadn't noticed he was there until she reached her current position. He wondered if she would be like the others at the orphanage and simply avoid him. He could tell by her eyes that she was one of the people who lived here. She had those weird-looking pearl-like eyes. Not to mention she was wearing a smaller kimono with a darker orange obi and with light purple flower designs. She seemed to have darker violet hair, so dark it was borderline black. He noticed that she shifted her weight slightly before regaining her senses and looking at the floor. So maybe she was like the other kids after all. He turned his attention back to the swimming koi before hearing a slight shuffling sound. He looked back up to see the girl was timidly walking towards a bench on the opposite side of the pond. At least she didn't completely ignore him. He could see her glance at him a few times before settling down on the wooden seat. Naruto continued to stare at the girl as she shifted her light of sight to the pond. After a few moments, she looked up to see him staring at her and flushed before quickly looking down. Apparently, she wasn't used to being around someone her own age. As Naruto continued to stare, he noticed how incredibly pale her skin was. Was she always cooped up inside? He couldn't help but be slightly unnerved by something. Maybe it was because someone his own age was actually willing to stay around him. So he decided to break the uneasy silence that seemed to encompass the area. Hi, I'm Uzumaki Naruto. What's your name? The girl seemed startled and looked up quickly. Huh. Naruto frowned slightly. Your name? Oh, my name is Hyuga H. Hinata. She seemed nervous, or did she just naturally have the stutter? Nice to meet you, Hinata. The girl meekly nodded before returning her gaze to the pond. The silence began to take hold again. So, do you live here? The girl nodded again without looking up. What's it like? This is my first time ever being in place like this. Well, it's hard to describe really. Why? Hinata shook her head. Why did he have to be so talkative? She just wanted a moment of peace away from everything while her father was in a meeting. She knew he was probably trying to be nice. It's a long story. Well, I've got time. I don't know what they wanted Ryu for, but we kinda got separated. Ryu, the name sounded somewhat familiar. Could he be talking about the man that her father had told her had saved her? She'd seen the man wandering around the compound sometimes, but never talked to him. If he was talking about that man, she should at least satisfy part of the boy's curiosity. After all, she owed much to the man who was apparently this boy's escort. She sighed quietly before looking back up. For the first time she noticed his cerulean orbs that were trained on her. She couldn't help but think they looked exactly like the pool of whatever in front of them. Soon, small talk began to fill the clearing back by the pond, as the youth talked about random things and asked each other questions. Hinata was surprised to hear that he'd only recently moved into an apartment with Ryu. He'd been at the orphanage before that, and the stories he told her about what happened there made her heart sink. She never knew any of the things he'd described. She'd always had someone around. Whether it be her father, mother, or uncle, she'd always had the company of someone else. Even the branch members that watched over everything at the complex seemed to reinforce the feeling of someone always there, even if they weren't always seen. They talked about themselves and the others they knew. Naruto especially seemed to be fond of Ryu, which made Hinata smile slightly. They talked about anything that came to their minds. Anything at all. After a while, Naruto could hear footsteps coming from the hallway again. He turned to look and saw another guard appear. A few short moments, Ryu joined him at the door. Ryu looked around and noticed that Naruto was next to the koi pond. He also saw a small girl that seemed to be his company. It seemed that the two of them were talking before he came outside. Ryu grinned and headed over to the pond. As soon as he stepped out onto the cobblestone pathway and took a few steps, he was already confronted by Naruto. Is everything done? Did you have a meeting? What did they want? Can we go now? Ryu smirked at the boy's usual hyperness. Yes, Naruto, we're done. We're leaving as soon as we head back out front. The boy nodded eagerly and turned back to look at the pond. It was nice to meet and talk to you, Hinata. Bye. The girl nodded slightly and waved timidly to the loud boy before looking back down towards the ground. Ryu raised an eyebrow before putting a hand on the back of Naruto's head and guiding him towards the door. The boy started to whine and told Ryu to stop treating him like a kid. If you aren't a kid, then what are you? Naruto snorted and crossed his arms, seeming to give up after he couldn't find a suitable answer. After they reached the front of the complex, both boys grabbed their footwear and headed outside. Ryu turned and bowed slightly to their escort while Naruto just rolled his eyes. As soon as they walked through the front gates of the complex, Naruto could hear Ryu grumbling. Stupid politics. Naruto looked at the man, confused. What happened? Ryu looked down at the boy and sighed. Apparently I was called to a council meeting, in which they asked me to choose a reward that would be on the same level as the rescuing of the heir. They didn't want to look ungrateful or show that they were incapable of being able to give back to others. It's some political nonsense that comes with being in a high-class, well-known clan. They don't want to show others they are weak in any sense. Naruto looked even more confused at Ryu's explanation, which caused the black-eyed man to grin. Don't worry about it, Naruto. You won't get involved in this kind of stuff until you're older anyway. So, if they asked you to choose something, did you think of something good? Ryu shook his head. I don't want anything. I kept saying I didn't want anything, but they didn't accept that as my decision and kept pressing. So I finally gave in and said if they wanted to help me in any way, they'd give me the support of the Hyuga clan if I was in dire straits or if I asked for it. Oh, Ryu ruffled the blonde's hair. Don't worry about it, squirt. Don't call me that. Naruto fumed. Why? You are a squirt. The walk back to the apartment was nowhere near quiet, as Naruto protested loudly to Ryu's various nicknames. And the attention drawn by the loud outbursts was nowhere near friendly. The next day found Ryu standing in front of the old Hokage once again. The two were in the moderately sized office alone, but Ryu could feel eyes on his back. They were under constant watch. Ryu looked through the black shaded glasses that he'd finally decided on earlier that morning. He'd been looking for some sort of eye covering for days, but couldn't find darker glasses that would cover the side of his eyes in addition to his eyes. He'd finally found a pair that he liked and fit nicely. The frame only ran along the top of the glasses, leaving the bottom and sides to hang free from the grasp of the black metal. The shades themselves were close to 6 centimeters from top to bottom near the nose piece, but gradually lost length as they tapered towards the ear. The length of the shades when reached the ear pieces was cut down to about 3 centimeters, but still covered the side of his face. And everything was solid black. He'd even asked if they could add an extra coat to tint it an even darker color, which they agreed to. Now, no one could see his eyes if he didn't want them to. Which was very good. The glasses also matched his darker color scheme for his clothing, black and darker blue. Now, he stood in front of the old man, wondering what he had in mind for this supposed test of skills. The Hokage seemed to notice his discomfort, which made the old man grin slightly. After a few moments of silence, the doors to the office opened to emit others. As Ryu turned to look over his should, he could see 2 figures. One had particularly short and spiky black hair, which seemed to be kept up by a Hittite, and was smoking a cigarette. He had a thin black beard that seemed to grow thicker on the chin as it grew out to form a small point. His brown eyes seemed to hold a small hint of uncaring as he looked around the room. The other figure had odd silver-colored hair that slanted off to the left slightly. His Hittite pulled down to cover his left eye and a mask that covered everything on his face and neck, aside from just below his eyes. His right eyelid sagged slightly, as if he was disinterested in everything. Ah, good. Now that the 3 of you are here, I can explain the test. The black-haired man raised an eyebrow. Test. The old Hokage nodded. A test of skills is needed and the 2 of you are to be the examiners. Kakashi looked toward the Hokage and then focused his attentions on the trench coat-wearing boy in front of him. What exactly is the exam, Hokage-sama? Kakashi asked as he continued to look at the boy. There will be 2 parts to the test. The first will be a test of stealth and mental aptitude. Kakashi, Asuma, you 2 will attempt to track down Ryuki here after he is given a period of grace to hide himself and keep away from you. There will be 2 parts to this test. Ryuki, you are to avoid any and all contact with the 2 of them while trying to cause as much damage to them as possible. The other part of this is that all of this must be done at a distance. Ryuki nodded, fully understanding the test. It was a test to see if he could remain hidden from enemies and still be able to attack and injure or distract them. The grace period will be 10 minutes. After that, you must keep to the guidelines for 2 hours. Understood. When all 3 figures nodded, the old man smiled. Now, if you'll head for training ground 44, you can get started immediately. But Hokage-sama, no arguing. It will also test on how the boy can adapt to having more than one enemy and from more than one source. Ryu was slightly unnerved by that. Was there something bad about this training area 44? Ryu stood in front of a locked gate in awe. The forest itself seemed to be completely closed off from any outside contact or influence. He suddenly felt very uneasy and doubtful. When Kakashi unlocked the gate, he gave Ryu a look and motioned for him to head inside with his head. You have 10 minutes, starting now. Go. Ryu simply nodded and sped through the gate faster than both men could follow. Asuma raised an eyebrow at the speed the kid displayed. If that was an indicator of his ability, then things could prove to be very interesting. As soon as Ryu was in the forest, he immediately activated his all-seeing eyes and looked around. The Byakugan proved to be very helpful in various situations, and this was one of them. He saw what the old man had meant by outside obstacles. He could see various forms of life in the forest, some passive and others more active and dangerous. He could see various forms of tree leeches in a few select trees and took note of what kind of tree they seemed to prefer before continuing to look around. Snakes, both very large and small, seemed to cover the forest in every direction. His mind immediately began working as he saw various ditches, coves, groves and any other small hole in any surface. First, though, he had to make sure that they couldn't follow him. He ran towards where he saw a river and began his process to hide the only thing that could distinguish him in the forest. His scent. Kakashi looked up as he heard the small timer go off. The period of grace was up. Now, the hunt was on. Ryu didn't know how long it had been, but he was pretty sure that they were already out and looking for him. He'd already set up some basic traps, but also threw in a few triple-layer traps for some fun. The first wire didn't really do anything much, just trigger a small explosive tag. The second seemed a bit more fun, as when it was tripped, it would disturb the tree leeches sitting in the above trees, causing them to drop down and attack whatever had disturbed them. The last layer, however, was something more for himself. It was an extremely thin and practically invisible length of easily breakable wire that was infused with a little bit of energy. As soon as it was tripped, he would know where they were. He'd left a number of those small signals in a wide area, doing it as often as he could before moving on. He often spent his time in the tips of the tallest trees, looking down and around him to see if he could spot his pursuers. However, nothing came. He sat in wait for a while before slowly getting up from his squatting position and moving back towards a body of water. As he was heading towards the river, he felt one of the signals go off and turned to look in the direction of his trap. After a few moments, the black-haired one known as Asuma crossed into his field of vision. Asuma seemed to pause slightly for a moment before standing still and closing his eyes. Ryu knew what he was doing, but it wouldn't work. After being on the run for years, he was extremely well versed in keeping any sign of his chakra or any other kind of energy hidden. But that was about to change. Ryu flashed though a series of hand seals before stopping on Oushi and placing his hands on the floor. Doden. Supaiku no Hitome no Jutsu. The floor seemed to shake slightly before moving towards the target, who was now looking in his direction. But before Asuma could move forward, the ground in front of him gave slightly before launching small projectiles made of earth at him. He leapt back, only to receive a slight grazing wound on his shoulder from the spikes that shot from behind. It was a complete circle of projectiles that could only be avoided by launching himself high into the air or trying to defend himself. Asuma pulled out his trench knives and began to defend himself with the elongated wind blades. Little did he know that Ryu's eyes widened slightly as he saw the weapons that he had produced. Ryu quickly put a small pulse into the ground to keep the barrage up for a few more seconds before darting quickly to his left. He had a feeling that if he stayed in one position for any more than a few seconds after a technique, he knew he'd be caught. A few seconds after Ryu had left the area, the other, Proctor, appeared. He seemed to look around lazily before catching a small whiff of the boy's scent. He immediately began to follow, only to be halted by a wall of kunai that flew toward him. The kid was good at covering his tracks, Kakashi had to give him that. After numerous hit-and-run tactics, Ryu was content in hiding in a small waterlogged cave. He'd been able to delay both men at every single time he saw either of them, and then kept them off his trail. He knew there was something about the gray-haired Kakashi though. Something that he was hiding that would given him the advantage over Ryu. And that wasn't good. As Ryu began to slip out of the cave from his short rest, he activated his Dujutsu once again and looked around. No one was coming from any direction. Good. He slipped outside of the rock face and continued on. He'd continuously been setting up his small sentries that would alert him of the position of one or both of the other men, but most of them hadn't even been touched yet. It looked like they were on to him. He had to make sure to avoid them at all costs. He had to get through this. As he continued on his path, he was suddenly halted by a kunai that flew in front of him. Crap. He turned to look and noticed a very faint chakra signature in one of the trees to his left. As if to prove he was correct, Kakashi began to pull himself out of the small genjutsu and looked directly at him. Then Asuma seemingly appeared out of nowhere from his left. So they'd gotten around to working together and taking him down. Interesting. Just as he was about to continue on with the exercise, a piercing screech came from the gate. Asuma lowered his weapons and grunted, while Kakashi simply nodded. Time's up. Ryu sighed, thankful that he had at least run down the time enough with his tactics to avoid getting into a fight. All three men ran back towards the gate together, avoiding any potential threats that could have been lurking around. As they reached the chain-linked wall around the forest, they could see a person waiting for them by the gates. It was the same man that Ryu had seen a few days ago. The one that had escorted him to the orphanage. Kakashi-san, Asuma-san, Ryuki-san, please follow me. The second part of the test is now going to commence. All three men nodded and followed after the scarred Rado. Ryu looked around the small stadium-like structure for a moment. If anything, it looked like a place that should have normally held hundreds, maybe thousands, of people. But it was completely empty aside from him, his proctors and the Hokage with his escort. After a small explanation that this was the skills portion of the test, the Hokage simply sat back with Rado and motioned for them to start. Almost immediately, both Kakashi and Asuma were coming at Ryu with blinding speed. Kakashi reached the black-clad man first and began a series of physical attacks that had Ryu hard-pressed to block and dodge. Then Asuma came from his blind side and began to attack as well. He needed an out and fast. He leapt back slightly to feign giving them an opening before quickly switching his stance and catching Asuma's knee in a small ankle lock before he dragged the man in front of him while he used his hands as leverage. Kakashi quickly jumped over the black-haired man only to find that Ryu had let Asuma out of his lock and was spinning on his hands while bringing his feet back up in defense. He quickly back-flipped away, giving himself some breathing space and the little precious time he needed to activate both of his bloodlines. Although no one could see it, due to the glasses, small veins framed his eyes and a small red pinprick formed where a pupil would normally be, only to be surrounding by a red circle, and the circle surrounded by 3 red tomo. The instant both were activated, things seemed to be in slow motion for Ryu. The men standing in front of him slowly gaining their bearings was all the advantage he needed as he shot forward. He knew that if he used any kind of Juyuken that they would be immediately suspicious, so he switched to a more offensive style that his uncle had told him was his former teammate's style of combat. He leapt forward in a side roundhouse kick at Kakashi's head and a lowered fist to clip the still grounded Asuma. Both men dodged the close combat blows, but were once again driven back as he landed on his left hand, pivoted and swung both legs down in a double-legged sweeping move before spinning on his hand and kicking out with his left foot to attempt to hit Kakashi. Asuma was kicked in the shoulder where he received one of his glancing wounds earlier and winced. He used the momentum to roll along the ground and back to his feet before going back to assist Kakashi. Even though Ryu was facing the opposite direction, he could still see Asuma clearly. And thanks to the added effects of his second limit, he still seemed to be moving slightly slower. Ryu quickly braced his right hand on the ground and pushed chakra through his palms as he launched himself in a massive midair backflip. He also turned towards his 2 enemies before landing on the ground, giving neither of them the advantage they may have sought. The taijutsu fight continued on for several minutes before Kakashi saw that this was getting nowhere. He hated to have to use this against someone who may eventually become an ally, but he had no choice. Kakashi slipped back and put his right hand over the lower portion of his drooping hitai. As he smoothly pulled it up, it revealed a long scar that ran from just above his eye, down his closed eyelid and ended under the eye. He watched and waited for a few more moments before opening his left eye to reveal a blood-red eye with 3 tomo. The Sharingan was now in play. As soon as Ryu saw what Kakashi had been hiding, he paled. Things had just become way more complicated. Sarutobi watched with high amusement as the teenage boy seemed to be giving both men a run for their money in simple taijutsu combat. Though things changed after a few minutes when Kakashi had decided to go all out on the boy. Now Ryuki was facing 2 Junin-level opponents that were becoming increasingly serious, as Asuma, too, had pulled out his weapons of choice. Ryuki seemed to be constantly on guard, but no matter what either man did, they couldn't seem to hit him. When asked about it, he had simply said he was used to fleeing before fighting. Minutes flew by and the battle was still at a constant stalemate, despite the odds being against the boy. He could tell both of the Junin in the center ring were starting to tire. Kakashi had been using the activated Sharingan for some time now, and it was slowly draining away his energy. The bloodline of the Uchiha clan seemed to be best suited for those of the Uchiha blood, as it required an immense amount of chakra and stamina to keep it activated for extended periods of time. And although Kakashi was a seasoned veteran, Sarutobi knew that the man he limits, as well as anyone else. Asuma seemed to be faring better against the boy, but it seemed that he, too, was beginning to tire from the constant output of chakra into the trench knives. At this rate, it was simply a matter of who would outlast who. But the odd thing was that the boy didn't seem to be tired at all. He was still performing complicated dodging techniques and trying to attack when he could see an opening. One thing seemed to nag at the old man, though. How could the boy be that good if he said to be on the run for most of his life? He'd had to have been trained for years out in the wild to develop the kind of senses he was displaying. Either that or he had to have been trained by a very high-class shinobi. It was something that didn't really seem to sit right with the old Hokage. He concentrated back on the battle just in time to see Asuma get hit in the side with a crescent kick while Kakashi was driven away by several kunai that had been thrown by a lagging right hand. The boy continued to be a mystery. First, he seemingly adopted Naruto under the pretense that he and the boy were the same. Although he could understand that, he didn't know why it had happened so quickly. Then again, he could have gotten to know the boy far better than anyone else after the first day he arrived. And it had been 2 weeks. Second, was the fact that it seemed he had the Hyuga's full support in whatever he did. Sarutobi figured that it was in reaction to the boy saving the little girl that had been named heir a little more than a year ago, but to have a powerful clan react so quickly to give support to a total stranger was unnerving, to say the least. And lastly, the proof that was now before him. He was fighting on equal stage against 2 Junin-class enemies. And not newly inducted ones either. Granted, none of the men wanted to really hurt each other, but still, to be able to fight against both his enemies while never receiving a single blow was frightening. It was almost as if the boy could see and predict their every move and act accordingly. A larger amount of time had passed since the start of the fight and all 3 men were starting to show signs of tiredness. Kakashi was sweating slightly and seemed to drag along. Asuma was panting slightly while staring at the boy through one open eye. And the only sign that Ryuki was getting tired was the fact that his moves weren't as sharp or quick as they used to be. At that moment, the boy jumped back and began a series of seals that ended in the Tori seal. He quickly crossed his arms and mumbled what sounded like a technique name before swinging both arms down and producing 2 massive blades of wind that intersected each other. Both men jumped back only to be blown away from the impact of the technique on the ground. A shower of rock accompanied the small explosion, along with a cloud of smoke. As the small cloud dissipated, Sarutobi could see 2 long gashes where the technique had hit. They had to be about half a meter long and 1/4 of a meter thick. It was at that point that the old man stood up and called for the men below to stop. If this continued, one of them could be hurt. And badly. After using his Fuden Kei's no Tanaru no Jutsu, Ryu heard a call to stop. He looked up at the old man and saw a smile on his face. That will be all. Thank you for your demonstration and time, gentlemen. Ryu bowed before walking over to the 2 men who were slightly slow in getting up. Good match. You guys actually posed a pretty good threat when you began to fight somewhat seriously. Kakashi nodded and slipped the left part of his Hitai back down over his eye while Asuma sighed. The black-haired man quickly pulled out a pack of cigarettes before hitting the bottom of it a few times before pulling one out and lighting it. He took a drag and put the pack back in one of his vest pockets before nodding. It was an interesting and fun experience, to say the least. Ryu smirked at the response and nodded. Hopefully, next time we will be fighting with each other and not against. With that, he dipped his head slightly and began to walk away. The 4 remaining figures left in the stadium could only stare at the back of a boy clouded in mystery. He had greatly surprised them all with his abilities. The only problem was that he had no background. No one knew how he gained his experience or skill. No one knew how he refined his senses to detect even the slightly change in air pressure. And no one knew anything about him. Things were getting very interesting indeed. Today, Ryu had been called for some sort of meeting or whatnot. He wasn't really paying attention. Even though it had been only a few hours, Naruto was already beginning to miss Ryu. The man just had this feeling about him that made Naruto completely at peace. He was also very kind and understanding, and more than willing to help him out with anything he asked. The only thing that Naruto didn't really like was that he had chores to do. Ryu had said that he was to dry the dishes that Ryu washed and dispose of the trash. He said it was to teach Naruto some responsibility at an early age. While Naruto complained about it to simply try to get a rise out of the man, he actually didn't mind. Since he really had nothing to do, Naruto walked around town in his spare time. Only to notice that everyone avoided him like the plague. He could also see, and feel, harsh unforgiving stares directed in his general area. He was used to it though. The only place that he actually seemed accepted, aside from Ryu's apartment, was at Ichiraku Ramen. The old man always had a smile on his face and an empty stool ready for the boy whenever he came inside. The Hokage had given him a small allowance for as long as he could remember. It was almost as if the old man wanted him to get out into the town. But the reception he received wasn't exactly welcoming. By anyone's standards. He continued on through the streets for a while longer, simply walking around. He had nothing to do and didn't know of anything he could do. Although, he was growing slightly uncomfortable under the glares. Naruto looked up at the sky and noticed that the sun had moved a considerable distance. He laced his fingers together behind his head and began to walk back to the apartment. Maybe Ryu would be back when he got there. When Naruto walked through the apartment door, he noticed the table in the small living space was occupied by various things he hadn't seen in the rooms before. Chief amongst the items were large scrolls. There seemed to be more scrolls than anything else. Naruto could see Ryu's black trench hanging over one of the chairs, but he didn't see the man anywhere. After a few moments, the door to the bathroom opened and Ryu stepped out of the small room with a sigh. Naruto noticed he wasn't wearing most of his normal attire. In fact, all Ryu was wearing were his blue shorts and black undershirt. When Ryu finished stretching, he turned to go examine the things he'd been given, since he'd put the down almost immediately after he got home and took care of business. He noticed Naruto staring at him and he grinned. "What's up, Squirt? I didn't think you'd be back so soon." Naruto's curious face was suddenly marred by a scowl. He turned away indignantly and grumbled something Ryu couldn't hear. He forgot about that. Ryu had the most annoying habit to using pet names for Naruto. He absolutely hated the stupid names, but Ryu kept using them. It was like he was trying to get Naruto irritated. "Where did you run off to while I had to go meet the Hokage?" "Nowhere. I just wandered around." Ryu simply raised an eyebrow. That was the norm for Naruto, but he couldn't seem to shake the odd feeling he got when Naruto mentioned wandering around. "So, what did the old man want?" Ryu smirked. As to the point as always. The kid was blunt and told it how it was. That was one of the things he liked about him. "Oh, nothing. Just had to get the gear he assigned me," Ryu said as he pointed to the pile of stuff on the table. Naruto looked over and looked back. "So, what? Did you pass that stupid test?" Ryu grinned. "You could say that." He walked over to the table and pulled off a green flak jacket that Naruto had seen many of the shinobi around town wear. "This is kind of a proof of rank, I guess. You don't necessarily have to wear it, but it offers a greater amount of protection than simply wearing normal clothing." Naruto nodded, simply staring at the flak jacket. "Anyway, they said they would allow me to stay on as an active member of the shinobi ranks if I passed my probationary period without any real problems. I'm also on reduced pay, which basically means that some of the money on missions will go to the village and not me." "Probationary period? What's that?" Ryu smirked. "It basically means they don't trust me yet and want to watch what I do for a while before accepting me." Not that I blame them. Oh. Ryu ruffled the boy's hair. Don't worry about it, short stuff. We'll be fine. Naruto rolled his eyes and whined, stop calling me that. Why? You are short. I'm still a kid. Ryu chuckled, point taken. You're still a squirt though. Naruto growled and tried to pounce on the man in front of him, only to find himself laying on his back and looking up at a smiling Ryu. You're going to have to do better than that. Naruto scowled at the man before getting up and trying again, only to find himself hanging upside down while Ryu was hold onto to one of his legs. You should just give up. Naruto crossed his arms and seemed to pout slightly, causing the man to laugh. He set the kid down and turned back to the large number of scrolls sitting on the table. He walked over and laid his hand on one before sighing, this could take a while. He looked back over to Naruto who was currently climbing to his feet. Naruto, I'll be busy catching up with most of this stuff I have to read. Go mess around at the park for a while, okay? By the time you get back I should have dinner ready. Naruto nodded and walked out the door. He didn't need a jacket yet. Even though they were in the later part of the summer season, the air was still incredibly warm. Even at night, Naruto wandered through the streets before coming to a halt in front of the park. He stood and stared at the kids laughing while messing around. After a few moments of hesitation, he slowly made his way to the center of the play area. But as soon as he got to the area and the kids noticed him, so did the parents that were watching. Names suddenly rung out throughout the area as the parents called for their children to come back so they could leave. The 5-year-old boy sighed as he sat down on one of the swings and slowly began to fidget with it. He wasn't going forward and backward as much as he was side to side. He stared at the area the kids his age had just occupied in silence. He wondered what it would be like to simply be accepted. To be wanted by others his age. To be acknowledged. Sure, he had Ryu, but they hadn't known each other that long. From what Naruto could tell, he was a good guy. But that didn't have any real affect on him or some of his desires. For as long as he could remember, children his age had all avoided him. Even at the orphanage, he realized why he was lonely and bored most of the time now. He wanted friends. Someone his own age he could have fun with and possibly identify with. Someone his own age he joke with and laugh with. Someone his own age that he could visit and play with when he was bored. Naruto looked up at the sky and sighed. He didn't know how much time had passed, but he could guess it was a fair amount. The top of the sun was just starting to sink behind the Hokage monument. Shadows were starting to grow and extend. He looked back at the play area and sighed again before getting up. When Naruto got back to the apartment, he could see the lights on inside. And he could smell something good coming from inside. When he opened the door, he could see that the normal meal was set out. There was a small salad by Ryu's plate, which made Naruto cringe. He had no idea how the guy could eat all those greens. As he walked toward the table, the meal came more into focus. Rice was set out on the left side of the plate while the right was dominated mainly by what looked like marinated barbecue chicken and pork. And of course, a small cup of instant ramen. Naruto grinned at the setup. Ryu told him that they were going to try to eat a balanced meal when together, but Naruto still refused to eat any kind of salad. Rice or other products he could handle, but not most fruits or veggies. Ryu walked into the room with a couple of cups and set them down. Hey, just in time. The man motioned for him to take his spot at the table while sitting down himself. Soon, small talk was heard as Naruto asked in more detail about his day and meeting with the old man. As Ryu set to explaining most of what he could, the boy listened with what looked like an eager face. After dinner, the usual activities ensued. Ryu did his own little thing while Naruto watched a little bit of television. Of course, the boy could see Ryu look up at him occasionally out of the corner of his eye. Same old schedule. Naruto sighed before returning his eyes back to the set in front of him. But his mind wasn't on the program in front of him. He let his mind wander as he seemed to zone out in front of the TV. Days continued to fly by. Everything was under a set routine for a while, but Naruto began to change that. When he was bored or had free time, he would begin to pull pranks on people who annoyed him the most. Most were harmless little annoyances, but there were a few destructive ones. Like the time he'd filled a few balloons with paint and launched them in a crowd of people. Or painting over certain shop signs, shops that would usually harass or throw him out when he walked in. All in all, he was becoming a little hellion simply because of the way people acted towards him. Of course, when they brought it up with Ryu, Naruto simply smiled and tried to act as innocent as possible. But the older man didn't buy it. Especially not with the more permanent or destructive pranks. The ones that were harmless, he basically rolled his eyes and shut the door in the person's face. If anything, they deserved it. But Ryu tried to set down laws on how far Naruto could take his so-called pranks. And one was that he avoided any permanent damage to any building or person. That included graffiti or anything involving the use of paint or oil. Or tar. One prank, Naruto had actually managed to tar and feather one of the more snide members of the community. He'd always yell at Naruto for no reason and sometimes even try to abuse the boy. Needless to say, it only got worse after the little incident, but Naruto didn't care. In fact, Ryu seemed to have to try to keep a straight face as he looked at the man standing in the doorway. When the man left after his rant, Ryu shut the door calmly, turned around and started to laugh outright. He warned Naruto not to do it again though. And Naruto was happy to oblige after he was smacked upside the head by the same man with a small rod. Hard. He said it was retaliation for the humiliation the brat put him through. Naruto simply stuck his tongue out and ran from the man. As it was, Naruto had already turned 6 a couple weeks ago. It had been almost 3 months since he moved in with Ryu, and the man openly had celebrated his birthday on October 10th, which seemed to irritate some of the villagers to no end. Naruto could only smirk as they seemed disgusted and walked away from the small celebration at Ichiraku. The Hokage had even come and sat with them for a while as they enjoyed dinner. As Naruto started to get out more and more, he kept noticing the little things that caught his attention. Like the admiration that the villagers seemed to give the passing shinobi. And the respect they gave the old man. He noticed that the most. It was after thinking on it for a while before he approached Ryu about his position after the man had come back from one of his longer missions. I want to be a ninja. Ryu looked up with a raised brow. Oh, do you now? The boy nodded. And why is that? Naruto seemed to think for a second before looking back at the man. I'm sick of the way people look at me, treat me like I'm different. I've seen the way they admire the shinobi of the village. Especially the old man. I want to gain that kind of recognition for myself. To become a ninja and prove to them that I'm not just some other kid. To prove to them how strong I can be. To prove to them that I have a reason to exist. Ryu smiled. At least the kid was serious. You're still a little too young to enter into the academy. He saw Naruto's head droop, but I suppose in the off time I have on missions, I can help you out. It isn't going to be easy though, I'll warn you now. I'm going to be as hard on you as my uncle was on me. Naruto seemed to hesitate slightly before nodding once. Alright, first order of business, is to get you in shape. After that Ryu talked out a plan to himself while Naruto only watched in confusion. The guy could be a complete weirdo sometimes. But after he seemed to come up with a brief outline, Ryu nodded to himself. First, we're going to run a couple exercises. Once you get into better shape, weights. Naruto stared at the man before nodding numbly. Ryu could only smirk. The kid had no idea what he was getting into. Ryu spent a majority of this first couple of months or so with Naruto trying to condition him. The norm was to get up at a ridiculously early time in the morning and jog a few laps around the village. But after a while, the speed steadily increased as Naruto was getting better and better with his morning runs. After the first week alone, his pace was pretty decent. After the morning running session, Ryu would have Naruto do other normal training activities. Squats, push-ups, chin-ups, sit-ups, anything that he could think of to help strengthen the boy's body. The starting normal routine was 20 of each exercise before the boy would be allowed to rest. After a 2-hour break, Ryu would begin to teach him how to practice for himself when he wasn't there. He went through various moves and other exercises that Naruto could capitalize on when he was out on a mission. After the first month of work, Naruto was already doing 4 laps in the morning at a very decent pace, 50 of each exercise, and would train by himself constantly. With or without Ryu's supervision. It was during these lessons that Ryu learned that Naruto was a visual learner. Instead of listening to directions or following commands, he learned by actually seeing it done, and then mimicking the movement. He also learned how determined Naruto was. Even though it was only a recent goal, the boy put everything he had into his pre-academy tutoring. By the end of the second month, Naruto was running 5 laps every morning at close to a blistering pace, would do his workout exercises, and then do a cool-down run. Another 5 additional laps, but at a much slower pace. Ryu couldn't help but be amazed at how fast the kid was growing. They had taken a day off for Ryu's birthday, December 18th, which Naruto actually complained about. He said he didn't like doing nothing and that it was boring, which amused the man. Ryu's Christmas present to Naruto was a set of weights. The bands had several loops for modified weights and several small weights on the side as well. He told the boy that they would work with the weights on after the new year had passed. Naruto was eager, and ready, for anything new that Ryu could teach him, and the days off were an extreme annoyance. But when news had spread that the wife of the Hyuga clan leader had passed only 9 short months after giving birth to her second daughter, Ryu went to pay his respects to the clan. He'd forced Naruto to go with him, which aggravated the boy, but he followed anyway. Naruto had seen the pained and saddened look on the face of the little girl he'd met at the complex a while ago. Apparently, her mother had passed away just before her 6th birthday. The day after Christmas was a day of mourning for the Hyuga house, while many in the village seemed to mourn with them. He didn't like seeing the look of sadness on her face, but there was nothing he could do about it. It seemed that now she understood a little of his sadness, which she claimed she couldn't understand when they first met. His defiant attitude turned passive as he watched the girl clutch at the robes of a tall man. Naruto could only guess that it was the girl's father. Her pearl-like eyes released tears as she looked at a smiling picture of her mother on the small shrine dedicated to her. The odd thing was, Naruto could see that she had normal-looking eyes. She looked like every other normal woman he'd seen, not the ones in this huge house. The odd pearl-like eyes nowhere present on her visage. When Ryu went up to pay his respects, he followed the man. Ryu bowed slightly while Naruto tried to mimic the movement, only to pull off an awkward imitation of Ryu's pose. The man smiled slightly at the mistake, but he could tell the boy was serious. Although Hiashi had heard some rather negative things about Naruto, he couldn't really judge the boy. The pranks he seemed to pull only targeted those who treated him negatively, which was slightly admirable. On the other hand, it seemed that Ryu had done quite well with the blonde, which was a good sign. Naruto gave his condolences to Hinata for her loss, to which the girl seemed to blush slightly and nod. She shuffled behind her father slightly to try to hide herself from the normally loud boy, which confused him. He guessed that his first impression of her was right after all, a really shy girl. When they both left, the more depressive atmosphere set in again as the ceremony and process of grieving continued on. It would be many days before Hiashi would hear or see Ryu again. And his request was slightly attention-catching. He wished to continue Naruto's training in a more private area, since it seemed that people disturbed them when they went to the more public training grounds. Disturbed being a rather diluted version of what actually happened. Hiashi could see a change in the blonde boy, just in that short amount of time. And that was one of the reasons that he granted Ryu's request to let Ryu and Naruto have access to the Hyuga Complex dojo. He was also interested in seeing how Ryu was taught, since the lessons a person learned often were reflected in their teaching methods. Ryu thanked him profusely and asked if they could have access 3 days a week if he wasn't on a mission or out with other responsibilities. The clan head was hesitant until he learned that they would be rather early morning sessions. A small extension of morning exercises and meditation could easily cover the period of time Ryu wanted. Hiyashi agreed, but only on the condition that he, Hazashi, Neji and Hinata may sit in on any session they chose. Ryu accepted the terms with little to no question as to why. The Hyuga man figured the boy was smart enough to know why he wanted to view the training sessions. He only had to wait a slight amount of time before he could actually learn more about the enigma named Ryuki. Naruto had been training with the basic weights for a little over 3 weeks, which added to his impressive performance. The boy seemed to take to the extra weight with almost no notice. Of course, 5 additional kilograms per arm and leg wasn't really anything much. He continued his normal exercises every morning and even went to the training grounds a few times. Those few times often ended in disaster, as he was often chased off or confronted by various shinobi or villagers. When Ryu told him that they were moving up a stage in his training, he was thrilled. He couldn't wait to start. It was now that he found himself standing in the Hyuga complex dojo facing Ryu. His mentor had told him that they were moving up to sparring. Naruto was both excited and nervous. He knew that Ryu had been promoted to Junin slightly before Christmas and Hinata's mother's death. That meant that he was good, really good. While Ryu was home half the time, they continued with the same routine. Both would warm up and go through the exercises. Ryu claimed it was a way to calm down and unwind after a mission, which Naruto didn't argue with. The boy had continued with his training even when Ryu was gone. Sometimes even double time, but now the routine was being broken. Ryu had just returned from his latest mission the previous night and told him about the step up. Now, here he was, standing in the middle of the dojo floor simply staring at Ryu. He wasn't sure of what to do, until Ryu spoke. This is basic sparring. It will improve your form and fighting style slightly, until you find a style that suits you best. At first, I will simply counter-attack. If you fail to hit me even once in 50 attacks, then I'm going to go on the offensive. Understood. Naruto gulped and nodded nervously. He, being the brash and headstrong type he was, immediately rushed at Ryu, only to have the man dodge his punch. Never let an opponent see your backside. It's a weakness. He then felt a sharp pain in his left shoulder as Ryu brought his elbow down to counter. Naruto spun away and began the process anew, only to have Ryu dodge every single one of his attacks using no effort at all. Ryu was keeping mental track of the boy's attacks and when he reached the specific mark, changed completely. As Naruto tried to punch him again, he simply spun and swung his elbow in a slight arch that ended with hitting the back of the boy's head. Naruto shot forward with a cry of pain before turning back around, only to be kicked in the side. He rolled along the floor like a limp rag doll before coming to a halt by the sliding door. After a few moments, he pushed himself back on his feet and looked up at Ryu. Ryu's visage was stern and completely void of all emotion. He looked at Naruto for a moment longer before simply vanishing. Naruto was, once again, hit in the back of the head, but this time it was with a flat palm. As stumbled forward and moved to his left, only to stop as a fist impacted the floor near his side. He smirked to himself, realizing he'd dodged one of Ryu's attacks. The smirk quickly left his face as the hand suddenly flattened on the ground and his right side was kicked, once again. Hiyashi watched on the sidelines as Ryu continued to pummel the boy, not offering any advice at all aside from his first comment. It seemed as though he was letting pain be the teacher in these sessions, which Hiyashi could agree with. That method was tried and true. The smaller figure sitting next to him, however, cringed every time she saw the boy get hit. It was obvious Ryu was holding back his strength, but the sheer amount of blows he was landing on the boy made up for that fact. Hinata suddenly felt very lucky that her father at least gave her a chance in each training session, not like what was going on in front of her. He explained what she needed to do and expected her to do it. Naruto was offered no such luxury. Naruto landed hard, coughing slightly as the air was forced from his lungs. Get up. Naruto looked shakily up to Ryu, who was now standing over him. The stern look in his face and eyes still there. Naruto very slowly and very carefully stood up, favoring his left leg and right side. He looked up at Ryu with fear and determination in his eyes. I can see you're scared. Good. We need to force that fear out of you. After a few more minutes, Naruto fell once again. Only this time, he didn't have the ability to make it back up. He slowly rolled over on his back and stared at the ceiling. He was breathing hard and his body ached everywhere. No single spot was safe from Ryu's attacks. Ryu sat next to Naruto with his legs crossed. I would say I'm sorry for doing this to you, but I'm not. You asked for this. You chose this path for yourself. Naruto nodded lightly to prove he understood. You need to go through the pain and fear of what you will experience out in the real world. You need to face those obstacles and overcome them. You need to be strong in order to do this. Naruto nodded his head again in response. Ryu messed with his blonde hair and stood. Get cleaned up and relax. We're going to put off the normal exercises until later. Your body needs the rest. Naruto ever so slowly got to his feet, wincing with every movement he made. When he was on his feet, Ryu motioned for him to follow and he slowly did so. After they left the room, Hiashi turned to Hinata. It would be wise to remember his words, for he speaks the truth. You will face many things you must overcome and fear will be chief amongst your obstacles. You will need to gain strength if you are going to take my place as the head. To gain strength, you must have the will to get stronger. Hinata looked up at her father and nodded, yes. Prepare, Hinata. Hiashi stood and walked to the center of the dojo to signify that their training session was just about to begin. But Hinata couldn't really concentrate after seeing what had just happened. Thus, the training and punishments she received were slightly more harsh than normal, her distraction taking away from her focus in training. Naruto sighed as he stepped out of the hot shower. The warm water was enough to slightly soothe his aching muscles. Ryu wasn't kidding when he said things weren't going to be easy, Naruto thought to himself. The boy had thought that when they started, things couldn't get any worse.